Echo Minister Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Tewkesbury for bringing forward this debate this afternoon, and indeed to every member who's contributed with such knowledge and such sympathy for the victims of IRA bombings, especially those, of course, that have been supplied by weapons and explosives from Libya. We've heard this afternoon many tragic cases, many moving cases of victims who still have received no compensation, while they look around them and see other countries who have managed to obtain that compensation for the victims of terror instigated by the Libyan regime under Colonel Gaddafi. Now, the Honourable Member for Tewkesbury called upon the government to compensate victims now. He referred to other similar cases, the role of the Libyan government in the IRA terror campaign, and indeed he quoted the former Labour Foreign Secretary Jack Straw in his comments on Libyan-sponsored terror. My honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall, then came in and said quite clearly, and I think quite accurately, this is not a party political issue, but it's one of justice. She told the House of a harrowing case. Victims were told that this was a private matter, but she doesn't believe that, and I think nor should we. Then we heard from the Honourable Member for South Suffolk, and he drew our attention to a 22-year-old victim of the 1983 bombing of Harrods, a woman police officer who was killed in that bombing. And in that same bombing, a United States citizen was compensated eventually by Libya for that outrage. He wanted a similar sort of legislation to that's now been passed by Congress in the United States, the act that's called Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. It'll be interesting to see what the Minister says about that in his winding up remarks. We then heard from my honourable friend, the member for Jarrow, who's been a member of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee since 2004. And he said we must never forget the victims over so many years who are still suffering today. And that was generally the theme, of course, of this afternoon's debate. Following my honourable friend for Jarrow, we heard from, if I may, my honourable friend from Romford. He said it's time for this matter to be debated on the floor of this House, and at last we are debating it, that British citizens had been failed by their own government. As always, his words were strong and very, very clear. My honourable friend, the member for Poplar and Limehouse, is hoping that the Minister will be the champion of the campaign for compensation for these victims. He spoke about the IRA terror attack in his constituency in February 1996 and the effect that that had had upon victims. Following him, we heard from the honourable member, my honourable friend from Beckenham. It wasn't just explosives that were supplied by Libya. He told us the story of the 80 tons of weapons on the Swedish ship the Villa, a ship that included SAM missiles and RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, and of course he should know better than anybody exactly how that happened. And then finally from the backbenches we heard from the honourable member for Strangford, who stands shoulder to shoulder with the innocent victims of terror, and was appalled at the differential treatment of victims on UK soil, those who were foreign victims treated somewhat better than those who were domestic victims. Madam Deputy Speaker, this debate, we know, is connected to a private member's bill submitted in the other place by Lord MP. We know that, according to Lord MP, since the lifting of sanctions against Libya in 2004, there have been a series of missed opportunities to sort out this issue of compensation for once and for all. The use of weapons supplied by the Libyan government only exacerbated the violence in Northern Ireland, but the government has rejected, not just this government, but previous governments, have rejected many calls from cross-party groups to civil society organisations to press upon the legitimate government, if we can find out who that is, of Libya to compensate the victims. And there's no doubt, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Gaddafi government did sponsor terrorism in Northern Ireland. We've heard many examples this afternoon, and of course other parts of the world. But from 2004, the Libyan government has been active in processes to compensate victims of terrorism in the United Kingdom by third parties that it sponsored, for example, the IRA. However, Since 2011, we know that Libya has descended into civil war, which considerably complicates matters of trying to obtain compensation. The United Kingdom government has made it clear that compensation should be pursued through civil proceedings for those victims of terrorism, which is, I have to say, in contrast to the United States, Germany and France, where the governments of those countries intervened forcefully and directly for compensation for victims of direct Libyan terror. The problem, as we know, is that Libya is in the throes of a civil war with competing authorities. Right now, there does not seem to be an end to that conflict, nor a clear picture of who the legitimate authorities are. Libya supplied the IRA in the 1970s and 80s at the height of the Troubles with vast quantities of weapons. We've heard this afternoon from many members present how much was supplied, especially from the Honourable Member for Beckenham. The amount of arms, I understand, was at least 1,000 rifles and appropriate ammunition, and at least 10 tons of Semtex, plus all the other destructive weapons that have claimed so many lives, of course.
I briefly intervene just to remind the House that many people died who were not killed by explosives, but using the weapons that Libya provided. We'll never be able to ascertain exactly who they were either.
The honourable member for that, the honourable and gallant member for that important contribution. Over 3,500 people died in the Troubles over many decades, and there's no doubt that the weapons, funding, training and explosives that Colonel Gaddafi provided to the Provisional IRA over the course of 25 years both extended and exacerbated the Northern Ireland Troubles and caused enormous human suffering. And that is a quote from the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee report of 2017. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me conclude with a number of questions, but first I want to just read two quotes. One is from the Minister himself, the member for Bedfordshire North East, in which he said, "There is no lawful basis on which the United Kingdom could seize or change the ownership of any Libyan assets. The United Nations Security Council resolution under which those assets were frozen, which the UK supported, is clear that they should eventually be returned for the benefit of the Libyan people. To breach that resolution would be a violation of international law." And then I want to quote again from the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee report, which said that the UK government cannot allow this litany of mischances to continue. There needs to be direct dialogue with the Libyan government. And if the situation there makes this impossible, the government must begin the process of establishing a fund themselves. And I'd be interested in the Minister's comments. So finally, if I could conclude with a number of questions, after just making it clear that on this side of the House, as I'm sure on every side of the House, or both sides of the House, we have nothing but sympathy and support for every single victim of IRA terrorism, especially when much of that bloodshed was assisted by Gaddafi's Libyan regime. So, in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister a number of questions. Firstly, is there incontrovertible evidence of the supply of up to 10 tons of Semtex and more than 1,000 rifles supplied by the Gaddafi regime to the IRA? Secondly, has the government compiled a list of the victims of the IRA and their families who it has evidence were victims of Libyan-sponsored IRA terrorism, a connection, in other words, between the two? Has the Foreign and Commonwealth Office spoken to whoever is currently recognised as the legitimate government of Libya about the possibility of providing any compensation for the supply of explosives and arms to the IRA by the Gaddafi regime? Has the Minister had any contact with those countries which have negotiated compensation deals with Libya on behalf of their citizens who are the victims of terrorism which was directly perpetrated or indirectly perpetrated by Libya? Fifthly, is the Foreign and Commonwealth Office providing every possible assistance to the families who were affected by Libyan-sponsored IRA terrorism? Is there any more the FCO can do to help and support those families and victims, such as, for example, the provision of translation services, or providing access to any evidence of the connection between the IRA and the then Libyan regime? And finally, could the Minister comment upon the Honourable Member for South Suffolk's point about the US victim of the 1983 Harrods bombing being compensated whilst his constituent is still waiting?